This week I'm going to be answering your questions. Last week on the community tab on my YouTube page, I put out the call for a Q&A. First of all, thank you for asking all of the questions. I really appreciate having all of you in this community. And loads of you put loads of good questions there, so I'm going to attempt to answer them all now. Now, Jimmy Graywall asked, have you tried any deep sky astrophotography with your Sony mirrorless cameras? How would you go about it? What about trying to shoot the Milky Way while under curfew in the light polluted skies of Dubai? So Jimmy, there are a few questions there, and I'll answer them one by one. I have tried shooting the Andromeda Galaxy with the A7R III, and I think I had the 200 to 400. I think I was around about 300 millimeters. It was interesting, and it did get a good image. I haven't processed those images yet, and they're on one of my hard drives somewhere, so I really do need to process them. But I kind of need to learn how to process all of those images to get one good final image with those. It's an interesting camera to use, and as long as it doesn't get too hot, you don't get too many hot pixels. But I had the A7 III, I had, like I said, the 100 to 400 millimeter, and then I had that on a tracker, and I had it on the Sky Adventurer. It was at its weight limit, but it worked really well. And again, underneath all of that, I had a big solid video tripod to keep it all steady and all still. It is interesting, and you can get some good images, but there are kind of rules you need to follow, and for deep space astrophotography, that's kind of something that I'm learning at the moment. If it's something that you're trying to get into, I'd do a lot of research online. I think there's a YouTuber called Astro Backyard. He does some fantastic tutorials. And even though he shoots most of his stuff with big telescopes, he also uses some DSLRs and some mirrorless cameras. And I think he's just bought the Canon EOS RA. So that's the astrophotography full frame equivalent. So even though it's a Canon and not a Sony, you might be able to learn a few things about what he's doing with that mirrorless camera. Now, your question about shooting the Milky Way and astrophotography from Dubai, there's no chance. The light pollution here is so high that you can only see a few little stars. I'm actually doing a video soon on the Bortle scale, which goes through those different sort of levels of light pollution and how it will affect your photos. But there's way too much light pollution here, and I can only see a few little stars. So there's no chance really. With astrophotography, it really is all about getting to a good location. Whether you drive for hours to get to that dark location, or you plan, say, a vacation to get to a good dark sky with a new moon, that's the best way to do it. And ultimately, that's the only way that you're going to get a really good exposure of that night sky. So the next one's from Mr. Photo. I like the username. When did you have your first paid shoots, and what were you shooting, and how did you pull the first ones on land? So I'm guessing, how did I pull the first ones off? I'm guessing that's what you meant in that question. Now, this is a great question. What I started to do was go along to events and just take photos of those events so I could get the feel of how it would work and how fast paced or slow paced or where I'd need to put myself to get good photos. Once I became comfortable with that, that's when I started charging. I think the first paid one that I did was of, I think it was some school event, and they'd hired out like a water park with wakeboarding and things like that going on at the park. But they had a big marquee and they were all there. All the women were in fancy dresses, all the guys were in suits, and I basically had to take photos of them and of the people in the area and of the people in the marquee and things like that, and just the general goings on of that evening. It was successful, it was stressful, but I got some good shots. And what you'll find is you'll start firing off some shots and it'll start like it's not going that well. But then as you get warmed up and as you really get into the event, you'll start getting some good shots. So the main thing is to go to some events that you may not even be affiliated with, say like some sporting events if you're into sports, or any other events and almost offer your services for free to start with. If you do that once or twice, then you can start doing other events once you've got that experience and once you're kind of confident in taking the photos and confident in getting the photos in that environment. That was a bit waffly, but I hope I answered your question. Now, Vagabond Original asked, I would love your take on focus modes specific to street photography. No setup, no flash. I've been watching your channel for ages, so I know you've covered some of this, but I keep trying all of the modes and chasing them all over. I was reluctant to ask at first, but I'm super interested in your take, and I figure there might be others like me. Or am I the only one? Now, first of all, if you're feeling reluctant to ask a question, really don't, because you can ask any question on here and I'll try and answer it the best I can. And if I can't answer it, I'll kind of point you in the right direction. As for street photography, that's not really my forte, but I would say with focus modes, maybe have something like the flexible spot, or if you're using a DSLR, you almost need to focus and recompose. So if you're using, say, the Sony a7 III, I'd use the flexible spot, and I'd probably use the touchscreen on the back. So I'd use my finger on the back to touch exactly where I want the focus to be, and then I'd take the shot. Now there's a YouTuber called Sean Tucker, and I'd suggest watching some of his stuff. He's got some really nice street photography photos. He does some really good stuff around London. So I'll put the link in the description below and go to Sean Tucker's YouTube page and have a look through his videos. He'll probably have something on focusing, but he may give you some other tips about street photography in general. So hopefully that'll help. The next question is from Maggie White, and Maggie asks, which metering mode would you use when photographing the moon and also astro? I have the Sony a7R III. Now, when photographing these two very different things, I'd go about it in a different way. I wouldn't use metering modes, but I'd put the camera into manual. When you're photographing the moon, there's actually a rule called the Looney 11 rule. Basically what this is you have your aperture at f11, and then whatever your ISO is, you have the corresponding number in your shutter speed. So you'd have aperture at f11. If you had your ISO at 100, you'd have your shutter speed at 1/100th of a second. Or if your ISO was at 400, you'd be shooting with a shutter speed of 1/400th of a second. So if you are shooting the moon, you'll be on a longer lens, and a lot of lenses do have their sweet spot between f8 and f11. Some will be closer to f8, some will be closer to f11. But this rule works really well for the moon. You do have to stop it down to f11 because that moon is so bright. And I'm guessing you're asking about metering modes because you've probably tried to take a photo of the moon before, and the moon's been really bright, and probably the sky around it's been very grey. But if you do shoot in manual mode, you kind of forget your metering modes and then follow the Looney 11 rule. So f11, your ISO at 100, shutter speed at 1/100th of a second. Your ISO at 800 and your shutter speed at 1/800th of a second. Now for astrophotography, this is very different. There's a lot less light about because you're only getting a star-filled sky, because normally with astrophotography, you'd go out when it's a new moon. I do tackle this in the same way as I'm in manual mode and I forget about the metering modes. But the first thing you need to follow is the 500 rule if you're on a full frame camera, or the 300 rule if you're on a crop censored camera. If you're not sure about the 500 rule, I've linked a video in the corner and in the description below. So once you've watched this video, go and check that one out. Basically, the 500 rule is where you divide 500 by your focal length, or if you're on a crop censored camera, you divide 300 by your focal length. And what this will do is give you your shutter speed. Let's say I'm shooting with a 25mm on a full frame camera. I'll take 500 and divide it by 25. That gives you 20 seconds. So then you'll set your shutter speed to 20 seconds. Then you'll set your aperture to its widest because there's so little light about. And then you'll change your ISO to suit. With astrophotography, because you've got such long exposures, you'll have your camera on your tripod, and so you'll have a lot of time to think about the exposure, and you'll have a lot of time to take a photo, check it on the back of the screen, and then change the settings accordingly. So you get your shutter speed, and then your widest aperture, and then dial in your ISO to suit. That's the best way to do it with astrophotography. Again, I've got a tutorial on that. So if you haven't seen that and you want to learn about astrophotography, click on the eye in the corner or the link in the description. The next question is from the Whiskey Brothers Records. And Mark asked, what's your favorite type of photography and what about it makes it your favorite? Now, this is a great question. And the one type of photography I love doing is any kind of sports photography where there's fast moving cars, motorbikes, kite surfers, anything like that. I've surfed, kite surfed and ridden motocross bikes and mountain bikes. So over the years, I've really enjoyed doing those sports. But over the years, I've really enjoyed photographing those sports as well. I really love putting myself in a position where no one else will want to go and getting a really unique shot. And also getting those panning shots where you have the land blurring its way around and you get that athlete on their bike or the athlete in their car perfectly crisp and sharp. I love getting those shots and I love just going to events. And if you ever see me at any one of these events, I'll pretty much be running my way around the whole track trying to find the best location for the best shot. I've been to so many events where the friends I've been shooting with have kind of lost me, and then a few hours later I come back. I'm absolutely knackered, probably a bit dehydrated, but I've got a ton of shots that I really love. Whenever I go to these events as well, I tend to take probably far too many shots. I end up coming back with 3,000, 4,000 or 5,000 shots. And I tend to get a load of good ones as well because I've done it so often and also because I've done those sports as well. But yeah, sports photography, that's what I love doing. So the next question is from Joe Essin. I shoot full manual mode, but I find I'm constantly at the ends in my aperture limits, e.g. shooting at f2.8 or f22. I'm not sure when I should be in the middle. The camera screen is never enough to really tell what is in and out of focus. I usually discover the changes I should have made when I'm in post-production. Any rules of thumb you follow for architecture, portraits, landscapes, etc. So I'm guessing you're at the ends because it's either too bright or it's too dark. Guessing you're at f2.8. As the light is dropping, you've pushed your aperture all of the way to its widest point to let in as much light as possible. But this might not be the look that you want because that does narrow that depth of focus. If this is the case, don't be scared about coming away from ISO 100. So maybe raise your ISO up to 800 to 1000, maybe a little bit more. I know shooting with this Sony a7 III, I can take my ISO up to about 6,400 to 8,000. And if there's a lot of detail in the shot, I can still get a really good, clear, crisp image. Most lenses have a sweet spot, and normally this is around about f8 to f11. So if you can close it down a bit, that's where you want to shoot. If it's too dark, you will obviously have to go to f2.8. But remember, you can bump that ISO up and close the aperture down a little bit. As for the other end of the scale, if you're at f22, I'm guessing there's a lot of light about. What you want to do there is raise your shutter speed or maybe get an ND filter. Then it'll bring it away from that smallest aperture. And also at f22, you will have diffraction. And what this will do is it's almost as if the light has to go through such a small hole that the light gets diffracted and the different parts or the different colors of light kind of hit your sensor in slightly different positions, and it'll make your image seem a little bit blurry. So what I tend to do, I don't worry too much about the f2.8 side, but when I'm at the other end on the smallest apertures, I close it down to around about f16 and I don't go much smaller because of this diffraction. So I kind of have that as a rule, so f16 or wider. I think what you need to do is just go out shooting in a really low pressured environment and really keep an eye on your aperture. Follow the rule of not going any smaller than f16 and then change your other two settings to suit. It might be worth buying maybe a 3-stop ND filter so you can bring it away from that f22 side. Now, if you're going for the shallow depth of focus look, f2.8 will be fine. But if you want a smaller aperture, giving you a slightly deeper depth of focus, that's when you'll need to bump your ISO up to give you enough light in your shot to get a good exposure. The next question is from Ben Video 16, and he's asking about using the A6000 from Sony with a kit lens, which is the 16-50 with astrophotography? And if not, is there a lens that would be good but not too expensive? Now that's a good question, Ben, and hopefully I'm going to do a video on this soon. I was going to do it sooner, but with lockdown, we're all kind of stuck in at the moment, so I can't quite get out to the location that I want to shoot the stars. The A6000 and the 16-50 is actually quite a good little package. You can take photos of the stars, but what I'd suggest is stacking your photos. I do have a tutorial on that, and it's linked in the eye in the corner and in the description below. So what you want to do is get your camera on a tripod, follow the general rules of astrophotography, but take a series of photos. So you'd take, say, 20 photos, and then you'd put them into a stacking program. And what this will do is look at all of the photos and it will remove a lot of the noise. And with a kit lens like the 16-50, I think at 16 it goes down to an aperture of 3.5. So it's not quite as good as 2.8, but it's better than f4 or f5.6. So it does let in quite a bit of light. But if you go and watch that tutorial, that'll teach you about stacking, and also go and watch the astrophotography tutorial that I've got for the crop sensitive cameras. If you put those two together, you'll be able to get some really good images just with that kit lens. So the next question is from Kay, and Kay asks how to time lapse on a gimbal whilst your camera moves from one point to another. I have the Ronin SC and my photos came out a little bit blurry. I'm not sure if it's due to the interval time, gimbal movement, or anything else. Now it's really hard to know without seeing the time lapse that you got what the problems were. Now I'm guessing that your shutter speed was a little bit too long, and while you were moving the camera, or while the gimbal was moving the camera, it was blurring your shots. So one thing you can try is using a faster shutter speed. That might help. However, that might bring you away from the 180-degree shutter rule. So you need to work on your shutter speed timings. Now I normally suggest with time lapses to have your shutter speed at half the time of the interval time. And say if you're shooting with a 2-second interval, that's a 1-second exposure. So any kind of movement with the camera will blur your shots. So I'm guessing that's what's happening. So all you need to do is shoot with a faster shutter speed. So it's getting the balance between getting that motion blur in your time lapse that you need with anything moving through your shot, and not blurring the shot from the actual movement of the camera. On a gimbal, it is a bit of a balancing act between the two. So what you need to do is maybe shoot 10 shots with the movement that you intend, and then have a look at them. And if there is movement blur in your shots from you moving the camera and not things moving through your shot, that's when you need to make the shutter speed faster. Now, once you get it to that point, you'll notice that your shots will become a lot more clear. The next question is by Peringotan, and they ask, all the camera reviews seem to be heavily influenced by the video features. I would like to know what would be a good upgrade to my Canon 500D for just photos. I am just a hobbyist photographer who wants to take my photography to the next level, but don't require any fancy video features, probably not even basic video features. Now this is a great question, but unfortunately most mirrorless cameras and DSLRs all have a lot more video features than they used to. So you're not going to really get away from this. You could go for say a slightly older DSLR like the Canon 5D Mark III or even the 5D Mark II. I think you can pick one of those up nowadays for around about $400 to $500. So you could get a slightly older one where it doesn't have all of those new video features on it. Now the only downside to getting an older camera like the 5D Mark II or the 5D Mark III is that you don't get all the benefits of the newest focusing systems. Now I shoot with Sony cameras, and even though I use them for videography and photography, when I'm just going out on a photo shoot, I still love the benefits that I get from the auto-focusing systems. They're really advanced, and I can pretty much put that square wherever I want in the frame. I don't obviously use any of those video features when I'm on a photography shoot, but they're still there. But the kind of advantages you get from the auto-focusing systems, maybe with a mirrorless, seeing the shot on the back of the camera or in the EVF before you've even taken it, these are just a few of the advantages you get from these modern cameras. Now, if you go for an older camera, or say a DSLR that doesn't have too many focusing squares or focusing cross points in that, then you'd have to do the focus and recompose kind of technique to get a good shot. So even though you'd like a camera without the video features, most of them do have it nowadays, and most of them are pretty much hybrid cameras. So if I was you, I'd just kind of bite the bullet, ignore the video features, and go for a modern camera that has some really good settings in it. Now, if you're not too worried about getting the most modern camera, like I said, go for something like the 5D Mark II or the 5D Mark III. You can pick a second-hand one up really cheap, and with the 5D Mark III, it does have a lot of really good features in for photography. It's also full frame, so it'll be a great upgrade from your 500D, and you will really notice the difference. Now, the only downside is you won't be able to use any of your APS-C lenses for that 5D Mark II or 5D Mark III. But there are so many Canon lenses about that on the secondhand market, again, the lenses are quite cheap, and you can get some really good lenses at really good values and really good prices. So I hope I've answered your question, and I hope I've kind of given you a few things to think about. The next question is from Al Sarp. And Al asks, can you make an Imaging Edge app tutorial for the A7 III? You can't use the phone screen to autofocus. Now, I really don't like the imaging app that comes for the Sony cameras. I kind of ignore it completely, and even though I've done, I think, one tutorial on it where I can get the images from my camera to my phone, I haven't used it much since then, because when you upgrade your phone, or upgrade the firmware on your phone and then upgrade the firmware on your camera at different times, sometimes they stop talking to each other. And it depends what phone you have, what operating system you use, and all of that. So there seems to be a lot of inconsistencies with this app. I really wish they'd actually make a decent app that worked really well, where you could have all of your features on your camera onto your phone. Now, that'd be fantastic. With the autofocusing, it is really frustrating, where you can't just touch the screen and get the focus to work where you want it to in that screen. Because in theory, they should be able to do that. In saying all of that, I am going to do a tutorial on the app to show you what it can do and what it can't do. And also, I'll probably talk about my annoyances with the app. But Sony, if you're watching, you really need to sort that app out because it's rubbish. So the next question is from Ricky Chemnitz. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that okay. If not, I apologize. And Ricky asked, do you use a flash meter when working in a studio? And if you do, can you make a guide on using a flash meter? Now, I don't use a flash meter. I have some base settings that I start with. I have all of my flashes on manual. I have my camera on manual, and then I'll tweak and tune the settings to suit until I get a shot that I really like. I've just found in doing it this way, I've learned a lot about the flashes and about my camera and about how it works in a studio environment. A flash meter probably would help, but I've never really got around to using one, and I've never really felt the need to have one. For now, I probably won't be making a tutorial on flash meters, but I'm guessing there's probably a lot of tutorials out there on YouTube that make some really good ones. I'll have a quick look, and if I find one, I'll link it in the description below. The next question is from Smellman_Smells. It's an interesting username. Anyway, Smellman_Smells asks, do you have any tips for portrait photography? I've got a shoot coming up in a few weeks and want to make it different. One tip I've received is to shoot around sunset. What do you think? Now, from what you've said, I'm guessing it's going to be portrait photography outdoors. And that one tip that you found is a good tip. You want to shoot around sunset or sunrise when you get that nice orange glow of light. This kind of gives it, well, it depends what you're doing with the light really. If you've got a sunset in the background, it could give a nice backlight if you've got a flash to fill your subject or fill the face of the person that you're shooting. The few tips that I would say is go for a longer focal length. So if you've only got a kit lens, go to the longest end. So if it's full frame, go to 70mm, or if it's a crop sensor, go to 55 or whatever the longest length is, maybe 50mm. And this will kind of push that background out of focus a little bit. If you can afford it, get a flash and get an off-camera flash trigger, and also get a softbox. Preferably, if you've got someone to hold that softbox, or if you put your camera on a tripod, you can put that softbox in different positions, but it's kind of better for you to be behind the camera and the flash to be in different positions. And then just kind of work with the person that you're taking photographs of. The best thing to get the most natural looking portraits is to build rapport with the person that you're taking the photographs of. To start with, they'll seem really nervous, so you just want to chat about everything and anything. Ask them about their family, ask them about what's going on in their lives, and then kind of talk about things and try and find something that makes them laugh or smile or kind of relax a little bit. This works really well if you're talking to them about something that they're really passionate about. You don't want them to talk too much, but if you get them to relax, you'll get a really good shot of them. When it comes to the technical side of things, you want to almost dial that in to start with before the person that you're taking photographs gets there. So if you've got an assistant, you can get the assistant to stand there, you take the photos, so you've got all of your settings sorted. So make sure you get there quite early, get the photos and get the levels that you want right. So when that person comes in, you're just trying to get the right expression from them as opposed to kind of fiddling around with settings. When I first did a few portraits, I made that mistake and it's a little bit tricky. You know, you're getting overexposed shots, underexposed shots, and you're kind of stressing about getting the right settings as opposed to making that person relaxed. So get your settings right to start with. Get an assistant, a member of your family or a friend to come and help along. Get them in front of your camera until you get the settings about right, and then keep those settings there, or think, right, what do I need to change? My ambient light or my flashlight? Or if you're not using a flashlight, how can I make it look better? Once you've got those settings dialed in, then get the person in and start taking photos of them and start thinking about them and getting them relaxed. That's probably about the best thing I could tell you for portrait photography. The next question is from Sophie-Anne Bendith. And again, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. Sophie-Anne asks EVF or OVF for macro shots. So for those of you who don't know what these abbreviations are, an EVF is an electronic viewfinder that you'd find on a mirrorless camera, and an OVF is an optical viewfinder you'd find on a DSLR. One just uses mirrors to actually look through the lens, and that's an OVF. And then an electronic viewfinder, or an EVF, is almost like a little monitor in that little viewfinder. Now, I actually prefer an EVF, even though it's a readout from the sensor and sometimes the resolution of that EVF isn't brilliant. You can actually see what the photo's going to be like before you take it. One of the reasons for this is because I've been shooting with Sony mirrorless cameras for the last 4 or 5, probably 6 or 7 years now actually. But I've been shooting with EVFs for such a long time that I'm really used to them and I really like them. One thing that I don't like about the OVF is, say if you get your settings out or your settings wrong, you'll take a shot and your shot can look very different to what you see through the viewfinder. This kind of goes with experience, but with an EVF, what you see in the viewfinder tends to be what your shot will look like. That is, unless you're using a flash. And then if you follow the kind of basics for flash photography, then you can kind of dial in those settings quite quickly. And if you're not sure about flash photography and want to learn more about flash photography, again, I've got it linked in the corner and down below in the description. Next question is from Alberto Moraes. Mike, I wish to know your opinion to get better and crispier landscape photography shots. Is it better to get a 61 megapixel Sony a7R IV, or can I do it stacking 3 or 4 vertical photos in Lightroom? Now, Alberto, I'm guessing you mean by stacking your vertical shots, you mean building a vertical panorama. This would obviously increase the megapixel count. So if you kind of took a shot with the a7R IV and those 61 megapixels, obviously there's tons of megapixels there, but unless you have a professional quality lens, you'll probably lose a bit of quality, especially if you've got an entry-level lens. So if you are going to go with the a7R IV, I'd suggest getting it with professional quality lenses like the GM lenses. This will then give you a lot more quality and you'll be able to get the most out of that 61 megapixel sensor, which is ridiculously huge. Now, if you have a camera already, if it's got a megapixel count between 20 and 30, or maybe even a bit more like the a7R II at 42 megapixels, you shouldn't have too much of a problem. And I'd probably do a vertical panorama with that. Any camera with 20 megapixels or more will produce a really nice image, as long as you know how to take a good image. As long as it's in focus, you've got your shutter speed to give you a nice, crisp, clear shot. These are the things that you need to do to get a good shot. Most cameras nowadays do really produce some great images if you just follow along with the basics. So if you've already got a camera, I'd stick with that, and maybe if you wanted a higher megapixel count, do that vertical panorama. Now, I was rambling a little bit there, but it all depends on what camera you have now and what lenses you have now. And what's the aim of the shot that you're going to get? Put a comment below and maybe we'll have a little bit of a conversation about what you want and what your needs are, and then maybe I can help in that way. The next question is from Saeed Al-Dosari. Again, I apologize if I pronounced your name wrong. So hopefully I did, but sorry if I didn't pronounce it right. But Saeed asks, how long did it take you to get your first 1,000 subscribers? He says, thank you so much for your awesome content. Well, thank you very much, Saeed. I try and produce videos pretty much every week, and I try and produce 2 every week. As for getting my first 1,000 subscribers, I think it took me around about 6 months. I produced videos every week, and I just kept going, and I answered as many of the comments as I could, and that's the way that I did it. I looked to see what content I'd like to see and what content that might give value to you guys, and then I started creating videos on those subjects. The other thing that I did was try to keep the videos short and sweet. So whatever the subject was, that's all I covered. I didn't take you on a journey down the coffee shop. I didn't do anything like that or ramble on about my day and how it was. I literally had the subject and I covered that subject. I think that's what helped me get to my first 1,000 subscribers. But if you're thinking about producing videos, it's well worth it. There's a lot of hard work, but if you follow that rule of keeping them short and succinct and start producing them on a weekly basis, you'll get to 1,000 subscribers quite quickly. So I hope I've answered your question. So Edgar asks, why photography? A very short and succinct question, but it's a good question as well. Basically, I got into photography after injuring my back riding motocross bikes. I wasn't able to ride anymore, so I thought I wanted to still be involved in the industry. So I bought a camera and I started taking photographs of motocrossers and motorbikes. I really enjoyed it and I was really into the motocross scene and I learned so much. And this was in the mid-90s. I was into photography before then, but this is when I properly got into photography. And this probably answers the question about what type of photography I'm into as well that was asked a little bit earlier on. I got into sports photography and I learnt the skill of photography while being at dusty motocross tracks. I had the EOS 5, yeah, there wasn't even a D. I had the EOS 5 and it took 5 frames a second. And when you've got a motocrosser hurling past you at God knows how fast and you fire through shots, a 36 exposure film goes really quickly. I can remember being at a motocross track in the UK called Fox Hills. I think I ended up going through about 20 or 30 rolls of film in a couple of days. That was when photography was really hard to learn and it was really expensive compared to what it is now. But that's why I got into photography and that's when I got the photography bug. And I've never really lost it. I kind of stopped photography a little bit in the early 2000s, but I was still working with photographers. And once again, when I got injured kite surfing, I then got back into photography again. But I love it. It's one of those things that you do and you can learn and you carry on learning. You almost go down that rabbit hole and the more you think you know, the more you need to learn and the more that you realize that you don't know and the more that you realize there's so much more to learn. That's why I love it, because I keep learning pretty much every single day with it. Now, once again, thank you all for asking questions. It was great to hear the questions that you have in photography on my channel and different things like that. And it's great to hear you guys get involved in this community. I want to try and build this as much as possible, and I want to carry on producing these videos on a weekly basis so you guys can learn as much about photography as possible. Because at the end of the day, I want to make you guys better photographers and kind of get the joy that I get out of photography as well. If you like this video and want to see more, I normally do photography tutorials and reviews. So try this one on astrophotography. And if you've already seen that one, check out this video down here on my Lightroom workflow. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for weekly tutorials on photography. I'll see you next time.